The first time Dr. Elena Moore saw the portrait, it did not feel like a discovery at all. It arrived at the museum in an ordinary cardboard box, wrapped in yellowed paper, and tied with a frayed piece of twine. Just one item in a small estate donation from a town in rural Georgia. The paperwork listed it blandly as family oil portrait, circa late 19th century. No famous artist, no celebrity sitter, no mention of any special value. It was the kind of object that usually ended up in storage, logged, labeled, and forgotten. Elena lifted the canvas from its wrapping and leaned it gently against the examination table. The varnish had darkened over time, turning the colors murky and the details slightly blurred. But the composition was familiar. A white, landowning family, posed on the veranda of a large house, the suggestion of fields stretching away into the painted distance. They were dressed in their finest clothes, eyes fixed on the viewer with well-practiced confidence. The father sat in a carved wooden chair, his hand resting on a cane. The mother's gloved fingers lightly touched the back of his chair, poised and controlled. Their children, 3 boys and a girl, were arranged around them like carefully placed ornaments. Behind them, half in shadow, stood 2 black figures in plain clothing, positioned with the careful invisibility reserved for servants. Elena had seen versions of this scene dozens of times in archives, books, and regional museums. Plantation wealth immortalized in paint, power frozen into an image. At first glance, there was nothing new here. Still, habit and training made her look closer. She rolled her stool nearer and adjusted the overhead light. The youngest son, perhaps 15 or 16, drew her attention first. Unlike his brothers, he did not seem fully settled into the pose. There was a tension in his shoulders, a strange uncertainty in his expression, as if he had been captured mid-thought rather than in the still composure expected at such sittings. One hand rested on the veranda rail, fingers curled slightly, and his gaze, though directed outward, seemed not to meet the viewer, but to pass straight through. Elena frowned. It might have been nothing more than the artist's uneven skill, or a restless boy forced to stand still too long. Yet something about that face tugged at her curiosity. She reached for the small magnifying glass she always kept on the table and leaned in. Under magnification, the brush strokes around the boy's shoulders and upper torso looked different, slightly thicker in places, as if the artist had painted over an earlier version, changing the outline or adjusting the angle. There was a faint, almost imperceptible halo where the paint did not quite match the surrounding texture. It was the kind of detail only a conservator or a very determined viewer would ever notice. She made a quick note in her log. Visible reworking around youngest son's figure. Possible later alteration. Then she checked the lower right corner of the canvas for a signature. Faint, partially obscured by darkened varnish, she could just make out a name. H. Cartwright, 1874. That date placed the painting in the uneasy years after the American Civil War, Reconstruction collapsing, old hierarchies reasserting themselves with new strategies and old brutality. A family portrait from 1874 Georgia was rarely just a family portrait. The file folder that came with the donation was thin. A typed note from the local attorney who handled the estate listed the last owner as Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield, deceased at 92. A one-line summary followed. Portrait believed to depict Whitfield family ancestors from late 1800s. No further context. No story. No explanation of why, After hanging in a private home for more than a century, the painting had finally been sent away. Elena had spent her career at the National Museum of American History, studying the visual language of power, how portraits, photographs, and paintings shaped what people chose to remember and what they preferred to forget. Most visitors saw only faces and clothing. Elena saw silences and omissions. She photographed the painting, logged its dimensions, and checked the stretcher and frame for any labels or markings. On the back of the frame, half hidden beneath a splintered support, she noticed a faint pencil note, practically lost under a smear of old dust. She squinted, brushed delicately with a soft cloth, and revealed 3 shaky words. "Don't ask again." The words were not part of any shipping label or gallery note. They looked personal, hurried, as if written in frustration or fear. Don't ask again. Ask what? And to whom? A small chill crept up her spine. It was ridiculous, she told herself. Artifacts carried traces of lives, that was all. People wrote things in the heat of arguments, then forgot about them. But the combination, a reworked figure, a tense young face, a strange note, refused to settle into the background. Later that afternoon, Elena carried the painting into the conservation lab for a preliminary surface examination. Under raking light, the distortions around the youngest son became even more clear. His outline had been shifted, the line of his jaw subtly redrawn, the edge of his coat softened and repainted. It was as if someone had tried to adjust not just his likeness, but his very presence. She thought of other portraits from that time in which unwanted figures, illegitimate children, disgraced relatives, had been painted out or painted over, their existence literally buried beneath new layers of pigment. Those cases were usually discovered only years later through X-ray imaging or pigment analysis. What if something or someone had once stood closer to this young man? A hand on his shoulder, a figure at his side. The thought lodged itself in her mind. That evening, long after most of her colleagues had gone home, Elena sat alone at her desk, the photograph of the painting open on her monitor. She zoomed in on the corner where the veranda railing met the boy's hand. There, barely visible beneath the final paint layer, was the ghost of a different line, an earlier shape that didn't quite match the current composition. An erased silhouette? A shifted body? On a separate screen, she opened the scanned copy of the estate paperwork again and reread the brief note about the Whitfield family. There was no mention of a missing heir, a scandal, or a dispute. Nothing to justify a warning like, "Don't ask again." She leaned back in her chair, staring at the image. Most donations came and went, with little more than routine documentation. But every so often, an object arrived that carried more weight than its description suggested. A letter that contradicted a textbook version of events. A photograph that caught something someone had tried very hard to hide. A painting with a single detail that refused to be ignored. This portrait felt like one of those objects. Elena closed her eyes for a moment, listening to the hum of the building's ventilation and the distant echo of a rolling cart in some far-off corridor. She knew from experience that following this curiosity might lead nowhere. Just an odd compositional choice by a long-dead painter. A family argument forever lost to time. But she also knew that some of the most important stories in the museum's collection had begun with exactly this kind of unease. A question that would not let go. When she opened her eyes again, the decision was made. she created a new digital folder on the museum's server and titled it Whitfield Portrait Investigation. Into it, she dropped the high-resolution images, the scan of the estate file, her conservation notes, and a fresh document labeled Research Leads. On the first line, she typed, 1. Confirm identities of Whitfield family members circa 1870s. Any record of youngest son disappearing, dying unexpectedly, or being disinherited? Then beneath it, 2. Check local Georgia newspapers for Whitfield name plus scandal, missing person, contested will. And finally, 3. Determine if any reference exists to a black heir, mixed heritage child, or disputed inheritance connected to Whitfield Plantation. The questions felt bold, even accusatory, but history had earned that suspicion. Portraits like this were not just decorations. They were declarations, statements of who belonged, who had power, and who was allowed to be seen. If someone had been painted out of this picture, there had to be a reason. As she saved the file, Elena glanced once more at the boy's uneasy face on her screen. He seemed, in that moment, less like a painted figure and more like a person caught between two worlds, between what had happened and what had been allowed to be remembered. The first chapter of this mystery did not end with answers. It ended with a choice. Elena pushed her chair back, shut off the lab lights, and walked out into the dim hallway, the portrait waiting behind her on the easel like a silent witness. Somewhere, buried in faded paper and brittle records, the rest of the story was waiting. And for reasons she could not yet name, she knew she would not be able to leave it alone. The next morning, Elena arrived at the museum earlier than usual, a takeaway coffee in one hand and a folded notepad in the other. Sleep had done nothing to quiet the questions circling in her mind. The Whitfield portrait no longer felt like just another object on her conservation schedule. It felt like the first page of a story that had been waiting a century and a half for someone to finally read it. She went straight to the research room, logged into the archives terminal, and pulled the county name from the estate paperwork. Whitfield, Harrow County, Georgia. A quick search through the museum's digital newspaper database brought up a handful of hits, old scans of regional papers with grand names like the Harrow County Sentinel and the Southern Clarion. Most of the mentions were mundane: announcements of harvest festivals, advertisements for land auctions, society wedding notices. But the surname Whitfield surfaced again and again in headlines and society columns, always linked with phrases like prominent landowner and pillar of the community. Elena refined the search, adding keywords: Whitfield son, Whitfield heir, Whitfield tragedy, Whitfield scandal. This time, one result caught her eye. A brief item dated 1876, 2 years after the painting's inscription. The headline was small but suggestive: Local family mourns sudden loss. She opened the article. It was only a few paragraphs long. According to the report, the esteemed Mr. Jonathan Whitfield and his wife lament the untimely passing of their youngest son, Thomas, aged 17. No details were given, no illness was mentioned, no accident described, just a vague note that the boy had been taken from this world too soon. The article praised the family's fortitude in the face of God's will, and moved on. Elena stared at the screen. The painting, signed 1874, showed a boy who appeared around 15 or 16. The article from 1876 spoke of a youngest son who died at 17. The dates lined up too neatly to ignore. She jotted in her notebook, youngest son, likely Thomas Whitfield, portrait painted C, 2 years before death. Cause not stated. The absence of detail bothered her. 19th century newspapers loved drama. They often dwelled on gruesome accidents, sudden illnesses, even rumors. Silence could be its own kind of clue. She expanded the search window to cover the next 2 years. A few months after the obituary, another article surfaced. This one was tucked deep in the paper, easy to miss. Disturbance reported near Whitfield Estate. It mentioned an unspecified altercation involving a colored laborer and a young gentleman of the household. The piece was maddeningly vague, but one line stood out. Authorities assure the public that the matter has been settled internally, and no further inquiry is required. Settled internally. Don't ask again. The words on the back of the frame echoed in her mind with new weight. Elena's fingers hovered over the keyboard as she considered her next step. If the young gentleman was Thomas, and the colored laborer was someone from the plantation workforce, then whatever had happened that day might have been the real beginning of the story the painting tried to conceal. She turned to another resource: census records. In the 1870 federal census for Harrow County, she found the Whitfield household listed on a digitized, sepia-toned scan. Jonathan Whitfield, 48. Elizabeth, 42. Children: Samuel, 20. Robert, 18. Henry, 16. Thomas, 13. Margaret, 10. Below them, on the same page, but in a separate cluster, were the names of black laborers and domestic workers on the estate. Men and women with surnames often missing or crudely spelled, their ages sometimes guessed rather than known. One name near the bottom of the page made her pause. Isaac, 19, farmhand. No surname, just a dash. Yet the enumerator had bothered to note his age carefully. She copied the census page into her folder and added a note. Possible connection. Isaac, no surname, 19, employed on Whitfield Plantation in 1870. Check later records for disappearance, arrest, or death. The deeper she dug, the more the painting began to look less like a proud family declaration and more like a desperate attempt to fix an idealized image in place. An image unbothered by conflict, untouched by scandal, untroubled by the presence of those whose labor had built the very wealth on display. At lunchtime, Elena forced herself to step away from the computer and returned to the conservation lab. The portrait waited where she had left it, the figures still frozen in their choreographed arrangement. Now, though, each face seemed to carry a slightly different expression under her gaze. The father's posture, once merely authoritative, took on a harder edge. The mother's poise looked more brittle than graceful. The older brother's relaxed confidence seemed tinged with entitlement. The young daughter's distant gaze suggested someone raised to observe, not to question. And the youngest son, Thomas, if her deductions were right, appeared even more out of place. His eyes, once just a detail of technique, now carried the weight of a boy poised on the brink of something catastrophic. Guilt, fear, or a dangerous kind of sympathy. Elena moved the light and studied the two black figures in the background. The painter had rendered them with less precision, their faces shadowed, their clothes indicated with broader strokes. They were present but peripheral, visible yet clearly not the subject of the painting. She knew from scholarship that this was common in plantation portraits. Enslaved people or formerly enslaved laborers included as symbolic props rather than full individuals. But here, she could not shake the feeling that their placement was deliberate and that their relationship to Thomas might be the key to everything. She zoomed in with her camera lens on the boy's hand, resting on the railing. Up close, the faintly different paint beneath the top layer suggested that the angle of his arm had once been slightly different, perhaps reaching out farther, or resting not on the rail alone but on something or someone beside him. What if the original composition had included a figure later removed? The idea quickened her pulse. It was not unheard of for portraits to be altered to erase unwanted people, estranged spouses, disinherited children, disgraced relatives. But erasing a black figure, a servant, a worker, or someone with a more complicated relationship to the family would have been even more likely in a world determined to maintain strict racial boundaries. If that figure had been standing close to Thomas, if their proximity had implied equality, closeness, or shared status, then scrubbing them out would have been an act of social self-preservation. By mid-afternoon, Elena had convinced herself that this was more than just artistic correction. She drafted a request to the museum's imaging specialist, asking for time on the X-ray and infrared reflectography equipment. Subject: possible overpainting, alteration, Whitfield portrait, C, 1874. In the justification line, she wrote, "Visible inconsistencies suggest compositional changes. Further analysis may reveal original arrangement." She hesitated only a second before hitting send. While she waited for approval, she returned to the paper trail. Another search in Georgia's digitized legal records uncovered a probate document from 1880, the will of Jonathan Whitfield. It listed his surviving sons, Samuel, Robert, and Henry, as primary heirs, with specified tracts of land and sums of money. Margaret, his daughter, received a smaller share, in keeping with her expected dowry. Conspicuously absent was any mention of Thomas, beyond a single line. "To the soul of my departed son Thomas, I commend the mercy of our Lord." No trust, no set-aside, no memorial gift in his name, nothing. At the very end of the document, however, was a curious clause. No claim of inheritance or legitimacy, whether by blood or by fabrication, from any person of colored descent, shall be recognized by my estate, now or henceforth. The language was unusually sharp, defensive in tone. Elena's breath caught. Such clauses sometimes appeared in wills when there had been rumors or realities of children fathered by white planters with black women, either during slavery or after. These unacknowledged heirs were often denied any legal standing, no matter how strong the evidence of their ancestry. She wrote in bold letters in her notes, "Will explicitly preempt claims from any person of colored descent." Why so specific? Whom were they afraid of? The Whitfield portrait was no longer just a fading relic. It was a stage set for a conflict that someone had tried very hard to bury. A vanished heir. A silenced servant or worker. A family guarding its money and reputation at all costs. Back in the lab, as the light outside shifted toward late afternoon, Elena studied the painting one last time before heading home. She imagined the day it had been completed in 1874. The family gathering on the veranda in stiff collars and heavy skirts, the painter adjusting his easel, the air thick with humidity and unspoken expectations. Had Thomas resented being placed there, slightly off to the side of his father's chair? Had he insisted that someone else stand closer to him, only to be overruled? Had a quiet crime or an ugly confrontation already taken place by then, casting an invisible shadow across the scene? The answers were still out of reach, buried in old newsprint, lost conversations, and pigment beneath pigment. But the lines around the story were becoming clearer. A portrait that once seemed generic now looked like a carefully curated lie, a visual insistence on a version of the Whitfield family that excluded anything inconvenient, improper, or threatening. As Elena turned off the lab lights and stepped into the hallway, she realized that the painting had already begun to change her work. She was no longer just preserving what history had chosen to show. She was preparing to uncover what it had deliberately concealed. And somewhere beneath that darkened layer of varnish, in the ghost of a painted-out figure and the uneasy gaze of a boy doomed to disappear, the past was waiting to speak. The X-ray images arrived 3 days later. Elena opened the file on her monitor with a mixture of excitement and dread, her heart tapping a fast rhythm against her ribs. The imaging specialist had left a brief note in the shared folder. "You were right to be suspicious. See attached. We need to talk." That alone was enough to confirm that the Whitfield portrait was not what it claimed to be. On the screen, the familiar family scene appeared in ghostly monochrome, stripped of color and varnish. The father, mother, and children were all there, but beneath the painted surface, subtle differences emerged. Edges sharpened, buried brush strokes surfaced. The X-ray penetrated the layers of paint and exposed what the final composition had tried to hide. Her eyes went first to Thomas. In the X-ray, his outline looked bolder, more confident. The angle of his arm was different, extended farther to his right, away from his body. And there, just where the veranda railing should have stood alone, was the unmistakable shadow of another form. A second figure. It was faint but undeniable. The blurred suggestion of a shoulder, the curve of an upper arm, a hint of a head, turned slightly toward the boy. The shape stood almost level with Thomas, not behind him, not below, side by side. Elena leaned in until the pixels began to separate. Whoever had once been painted there had been removed with care, but not perfectly. Some of the original underdrawing and massing remained, like a ghost, frozen in the canvas itself. She exhaled slowly, trying to steady the rush of thoughts. It was exactly what she had feared, and what, deep down, she had hoped to find. Someone had been painted out of this family portrait. Someone who had stood close enough to Thomas to suggest a relationship more intimate, more equal, than the Whitfields were later willing to admit. She flipped between the X-ray image and a high-resolution photograph of the painting as it appeared now. In the final layer, Thomas's hand rested on the railing alone, his body turned slightly inward, almost retreating. In the earlier version revealed by the X-ray, his arm reached outward, and the erased figure filled the space beside him like a puzzle piece that no longer matched the picture someone wanted the world to see. Her mind leapt back to the will, to that sharp clause forbidding any inheritance claims from any person of colored descent, to the newspaper item about an altercation with a colored laborer, and the promise that the matter had been settled internally, to the too brief obituary of a dead 17-year-old heir. A story was beginning to form, a dangerous one. The imaging specialist, Malik, knocked lightly on the lab door and stepped in. "So," he said, crossing his arms as he looked at the screen, "you weren't chasing shadows after all." "Someone was," Elena replied, nodding toward the ghostly figure. "They just didn't erase them completely." Malik tilted his head. "Whoever did this knew what they were doing. The overpainting is careful. They match the pigments, smoothed the transitions. Without imaging, you'd never know there used to be someone there. Any idea how long after the original painting it was changed? She asked. He shrugged. Hard to say without a full material analysis, but the crepe patterns suggest the overpaint isn't decades newer. Could have been done within a few years. A quick fix after a change in circumstances. A change in circumstances. Like a scandal. A disappearance. A death. After Malik left, Elena sat in the quiet lab, the X-ray image glowing in the dim light. The erased figure seemed to stare back at her, demanding to be acknowledged. Whoever that person had been, they had once occupied the same visual space as the Whitfield heir. Not in the background, not as a prop, but almost as a counterpart. To remove them was not a casual decision. It was an intentional rewriting of relationships, of memory. She opened her research notes and added a new line in bold. Erased figure beside Thomas. Likely black, given will language plus press item. Hypothesis. Mixed-race relative or favored laborer positioned too close to heir in original composition. Overpaint. Visual erasure of contested relationship. But hypotheses were not enough. She needed a name. Back in the research room, she returned to the Harrow County records, this time focusing on a narrower time frame, 1873 to 1878. Marriage licenses, property disputes, court dockets, arrest logs, anything. Buried in an 1877 court ledger, she found a brief entry that made her pulse spike. State versus Isaac, surname unknown, colored, charge, trespass and disorderly conduct on Whitfield estate. Disposition, case dismissed at request of complainant. There it was again, that name, Isaac. She searched further. A church register from a small Baptist congregation near the Whitfield land noted in 1869, baptism, Isaac, formerly of Whitfield Place. In 1882, a different line appeared in another congregation's book, this time 2 counties away. Received into fellowship, Isaac Carter, age approx 30, laborer from Harrow County. Carter, a chosen surname. A man once known only by a first name on a plantation, now claiming a full identity. Elena's chest tightened. If this Isaac had left the Whitfield place sometime after 1876, after Thomas's death in the quiet court case, his departure might not have been voluntary. Perhaps he had been driven out, warned away, or helped to escape. Either way, his absence on later censuses for the Whitfield property was itself a clue. She closed her eyes and let the fragments assemble themselves. A young heir and a young black worker grow up on the same land, their lives entangled in ways their world does not permit. A portrait is commissioned to display family stability and wealth, but in its first version, someone stands beside the heir who should never be seen as an equal. An incident occurs, an altercation, serious enough to warrant legal attention, then quickly buried. The heir dies, officially of an unspecified cause. The worker is charged, then released, then disappears from local records, and reappears later with a new surname, far from the plantation that once owned his labor. And in the middle of it all, that portrait is altered. One figure painted out, one arm repositioned, one story replaced with another. Elena knew better than to jump to conclusions. The archival record was a maze of missing pieces and biased accounts. But she also knew patterns when she saw them. The Whitfields had both motive and means to control the narrative, on paper, in court, and on canvas. Late that afternoon, she requested access to Freedmen's Bureau records and labor contracts for the region, hoping to trace Isaac's earlier years. Hours passed in a blur of digital scans and handwritten ledgers, until finally she found another thread. A contract dated 1867 bound several formerly enslaved workers to the Whitfield estate for a year in exchange for wages, food, and lodging. Most names were signed with an X, witnessed by local officials. One line read, Isaac X, age approx 15, field hand. The signature space was marked only with that crude cross, but beside it, in a different hand, someone had written, Smart, good with tools. Good with tools. A field hand who might also have been a carpenter, a builder, someone whose skills extended beyond the rows of cotton, someone who might have helped repair the very veranda where the family later chose to pose, standing just behind them, making the stage on which they performed their power. The irony was sharp enough to taste. By the time the museum lights dimmed for closing, Elena had filled page after page with notes, questions pressed in around her like the walls of the archive itself. Had Thomas tried to help Isaac leave? Had he promised something, money, land, recognition, that his father refused to honor? Had an argument turned deadly? Had the community quietly agreed to accept a sanitized version of events in exchange for stability and continued patronage? She gathered her papers and shut down the computer. But the story refused to stay in the building. On the train ride home, the erased figure and the boy with the uneasy eyes rode with her, hovering in the reflected glass of the window. The chapter of the Whitfield portrait's history that she was now entering was not clean or complete. It was jagged and contested, full of half-truths and deliberate gaps. Yet the very existence of those gaps was revealing. People only worked this hard to hide what mattered. Back in her apartment, Elena pinned a printed copy of the X-ray image above her desk. In the quiet lamplight, the Whitfield's outlines blurred into the background, but the faint, defiant presence of the missing figure seemed to sharpen. For the first time in more than a century, someone was looking directly at the person the painting had tried to erase. And though the name Isaac Carter was still only a strong possibility, not a proven fact, it was enough to turn a ghost into a human being, a person whose life had intersected with a wealthy family's so powerfully that they had chosen to rewrite their own portrait to escape the memory. Elena knew the next steps would be harder. She would need to verify her hunch, connect more dots, and confront what the story implied about inheritance, race, and violence in Reconstruction-era Georgia. But one thing was already clear. This was no longer just a mystery about a painting. It was an indictment of the way history itself is edited, of who is allowed to stand in the frame and who is pushed into the shadows. And somewhere, in the overlapping traces of ink and paint, she could feel the past beginning to push back. Elena had spent weeks tracing fragments, court notations, faded signatures, the ghost of a figure in the X-ray. Yet the story still felt like a room with the door only half open. She could see enough to know something terrible had happened on the Whitfield plantation, but not enough to say how or why it unfolded. That changed the day she found the letter. It was buried in a box that did not look promising at all. Miscellaneous correspondence, tax receipts, and brittle envelopes rescued from a collapsing courthouse storage room. Most of the ink had bled into the paper, turning words into cloudy stains. But one envelope, older than the rest and sealed with a cracked red wax, bore a name she now knew too well. To Mr. Jonathan Whitfield, Harrow County. The date in the corner read, March 3rd, 1877. Inside, the letter was written in an impatient, slanting hand. It was from the county sheriff. The language was stiff and formal, but the meaning was not. The sheriff confirmed that the matter concerning your late son and the colored boy had been handled with discretion, and that no further official inquiry shall be made, provided the earlier understanding remains in force. The earlier understanding. The letter went on to mention the satisfaction of certain outstanding debts owed by your office to the county, and the continued support of this administration during the upcoming election. It did not spell out the trade, but it did not have to. The implication was clear. The Whitfields had purchased silence, a dead heir, a living witness, and a sheriff willing to convert justice into a private transaction. Elena sat back in her chair, the letter trembling slightly in her fingers. Here, at last, was the outline of the dark bargain she had sensed in every omission and evasion. There had been an incident involving Thomas and Isaac, serious enough to merit legal attention, dangerous enough to threaten the Whitfields' reputation. The sheriff had stepped in, not to uncover the truth, but to rename it, contain it, and sell it back to the family. She reread the line, "No further official inquiry shall be made," and thought of the tiny obituary for Thomas. No cause of death, no hint of scandal, just a polite notice of a boy taken too soon. Somewhere between those two documents, the sheriff's bargain and the newspaper's innocence, the real story had been deliberately strangled. That afternoon, Elena requested access to a different set of records, private account books and ledgers confiscated from the Harrow County Courthouse decades later as part of a corruption investigation. In those uneven columns of ink, she found a series of miscellaneous payments made by the Whitfield estate in 1877 and 1878, entries that did not correspond to land taxes or business fees. Several were marked only with a single word: arrangements. But one notation stood out, a payment labeled "to I. Carter, per agreement," the amount large enough to be impossible to ignore. The date was 6 months after Thomas's death, and several months after the dismissed trespass case. A second payment followed a year later, this time recorded as final settlement. Elena stared at the figures, a chill settling into her bones. The Whitfields had not only bought off officials, they had also paid the one person who could have destroyed their carefully constructed narrative. Isaac had been pressed into a deal just as surely as the sheriff. Money in exchange for absence. Absence from the plantation, absence from the region, absence from any formal accusation that might stain the Whitfield name forever. It was a dark kind of justice, compensation that also functioned as erasure. She tried to imagine that meeting. A young black man, barely into adulthood, summoned to a back room or a side office, handed money he had never seen before, and told in no uncertain terms what it cost. Take this and go. Do not come back. Do not speak. Do not claim what you might be owed. On the other side of that table, a father determined to salvage what remained of his legacy. A sheriff, eager to keep wealthy patrons on his side. Perhaps even a lawyer, quietly drafting papers while pretending this was the best anyone could hope for. In the museum's quiet reading room, centuries away from that moment, Elena felt anger rise up, hot and sharp. The ledger lines were so calm, so clinical, per agreement, final settlement, as if they recorded a simple business transaction rather than the silencing of a life and the burial of a crime. And then there was the portrait. She returned to the lab that evening switching on the focused lights above the painting. Knowing what she knew now, the overpainted space beside Thomas seemed almost to vibrate with tension. In the first version, Isaac, or whoever the erased figure had been, had stood near enough that any viewer would have registered his presence. A black man at the heir's side, not in the background. In the revised version, that possibility had been scrubbed clean. The agreement in the ledger had not been only about money and exile, it had also been about images. The painting, the obituary, the court records, the will, they all worked together to tell a version of the story in which the Whitfields were orderly, respectable, untouched by scandal. Thomas's death became tragic, but meaningless. Isaac's departure became invisible. What nobody counted on was the betrayal of time, pigments that cracked, notes that survived in forgotten boxes, tools that could see through paint and paper both. Later that week, Elena made a trip to the small town 2 counties away, where an Isaac Carter had joined a congregation in the 1880s. The church building had been rebuilt twice since then, but the pastor welcomed her into a cramped back office where old registers and minute books were stored on sagging shelves. Together they leafed through brittle pages until they reached a section from 1883. There, written in a careful clerk's hand, was an entry that made Elena's breath catch. Brother Isaac Carter gave testimony today of his former life in bondage and the troubles that befell him on a plantation in Harrow County. He spoke of a young master who paid for his courage with blood and of a bargain struck so that he might live, though far from the land he knew. The brethren were moved to tears and prayer. No names, no precise details that would satisfy a historian's footnote, but the shape of the story was unmistakable. A young master who paid with his life, a man allowed to leave only by accepting a silence he could never fully outrun. Elena copied the passage word for word into her notebook, her hand shaking. This was the missing human voice behind the cold numbers in the ledger and the careful edits on the canvas. Isaac had not entirely stayed silent. He had carried the truth into a new community, where it became testimony instead of accusation, witness instead of evidence. It had not reached the newspapers or the courts, but it had reached ears that mattered to him. On the train back to the city, dusk streaking the windows with muted color, Elena realized that the dark deal at the heart of the Whitfield story was more complicated than a simple payoff. Yes, it was a transaction of money for quiet, power for safety, but it was also a collision of 2 kinds of memory: the official version, written into law and image, and the lived version, carried in voices and faith, passed down in small rooms instead of large halls. The Whitfields had tried to buy a future in which their version was the only one that survived. The portrait on the wall, the clean obituary, the restrictive clause in the will, the sheriff's promise that no further official inquiry shall be made. Yet here she was, in the 21st century, holding a cracked letter, a church register, and an X-ray that refused to obey those old instructions. Inquiry had found its way back. Back at the museum that night, Elena pinned a new set of pages beside the X-ray printout. The sheriff's letter, the ledger entries, the church testimony. The wall of her office now looked less like a workplace and more like a crime board. Lines of ink tying together people who had never imagined their names would share the same future sheet of paper. Jonathan Whitfield, the sheriff, the nameless clerk who wrote, per agreement, the painter who obeyed instructions and painted someone out. Isaac, who signed with an X and later claimed a surname. Thomas, whose eyes had always looked uneasy, even in paint. For the first time, Elena could see not just injustice, but motive. Not just erasure, but fear. The fear that a single relationship, a bond that crossed lines of race and power, could unravel everything the Whitfields believed they were entitled to keep. Land, money, honor, a place in the county's story. The price of preserving that illusion had been a boy's life and a man's exile. The painting, once a simple piece of decor, had become a monument to that decision. But now, as Elena traced the shape of the erased figure on the X-ray with her fingertip, she understood something else. The Whitfields had lost more than they knew. In their effort to control the narrative, they had left a trail of contradictions and shadows so stark that once noticed, they practically demanded investigation. Their lie was too perfect, too smooth. It invited doubt. And doubt in the hands of someone like her was the beginning of the end of their version of history. The fourth chapter of the Whitfield portrait's story closed not with a solved mystery, but with an exposed wound, a dark deal dragged into the light, its terms finally legible. Money for silence, paint for disappearance, official records for respectability. What remained, Elena thought as she turned off the office light, was the hardest part, deciding what to do with the truth now that it was hers to tell. By the time the Whitfield portrait finally hung on the museum wall, it was no longer just a painting to Elena. It was evidence. It was testimony. It was a question framed in gold and pointed directly at anyone willing to look closely enough. The exhibition opened on a gray Saturday morning, the kind of day when visitors drifted into the museum in search of warmth and distraction. School groups, couples, solo wanderers with headphones, none of them knew, as they stepped through the entrance, that an old family secret waited for them on the other side of a quiet gallery door. Elena stood off to the side as the first wave of people entered the room. She had insisted that the Whitfield portrait be displayed twice, once in its original restored form on a central wall, and again as an X-ray reproduction across from it. Between them, like a bridge running through time, she had placed the documents, the sheriff's letter, the ledger entries, the church register, excerpts from the will. Each object had a small label, concise but sharp, guiding the viewer toward the connections she had spent months uncovering. At first, people reacted the way they always did to 19th century portraits. A glance, a nod, maybe a quick comment about the clothing or the stiff poses. Then their eyes snagged on the text. Family portrait, Whitfield Plantation, Harrow County, Georgia, 1874, the main label read. Later altered to remove a figure who once stood beside the youngest son. Visitors looked again. They stepped closer. Someone noticed the boy's expression and frowned. Someone else tilted their head, comparing the painted surface to the X-ray image across the way, where the erased figure hovered in spectral outline. A group of teenagers clustered around the reproduction, pointing at the faint second shoulder, the ghost arm that had almost, but not quite, been wiped from existence. Beside the documents, a short panel laid out the essentials in plain, unflinching language. The suspicious obituary, the dismissed trespass case, the sheriff's bargain, the paid-off witness, the church testimony about a young master who paid for his courage with blood. There were no melodramatic flourishes, no accusations written in fire, just the steady accumulation of facts that, when placed side by side, refused to be anything but damning. A middle-aged woman read the panel once, then again more slowly. "So they literally painted him out," she murmured to the man next to her, "like he never stood there at all." "Until you shine the right light on it," he answered, gesturing toward the X-ray. Elena felt something loosen in her chest. That was the point, after all. Not just to expose one family's wrongdoing, but to show how power worked, how it could shape not only lives and laws, but memory and images themselves. How the record we inherit is not neutral, but edited. Near the end of the gallery, a final wall carried a question, rather than an explanation. What stories have been painted out of the history you were taught? Whose absence once seemed normal to you, until you learned to look for it? Below the text, visitors could leave small cards with their own reflections. By midday, the board was already filling. Some wrote about school lessons that had skipped over slavery or Reconstruction. Others mentioned relatives whose histories had been hidden because of race, class, or scandal. A few wrote only a name and a date, as if pinning a lost person back into the frame of time. For Elena, the most striking note was a simple sentence from a teenager. "I didn't know a painting could lie." She smiled sadly when she read it. Paintings could lie, yes, but only if no one asked them difficult questions. Only if no one was willing to go beyond the surface. Later that afternoon, the museum scheduled a public talk in the gallery. Elena stood in front of the portrait, a small microphone clipped to her jacket, and faced a semicircle of chairs filled with visitors. The Whitfield family stared over her shoulder, frozen in their practiced dignity, while, unseen on the X-ray across the room, Isaac's erased outline held its quiet ground. She did not dramatize the story. The facts did that on their own. She walked the audience through each step. The overpainted figure, the will's defensive language, the sheriff's letter, the ledger entries, the church record. She emphasized what she could prove and where she had to use caution. She named the limits of the archive and the biases of every document in it. Then she said the part that mattered most to her. "This portrait is not unique because something unjust happened around it," she told them. "It is unique because, in this case, the tools and records survived to let us see through the lie. The Whitfields are not an anomaly. They are a lens. They show us how power protected itself, who got to be remembered, and who got pushed to the edge of the frame, or out of it entirely." A hand went up in the audience. A young man asked, "Do you ever feel like it's too late to do anything about it? I mean, everyone involved is long dead. What good does exposing this now really do?" The question hung in the air for a moment. Elena glanced at the portrait before answering. "It's true we can't prosecute anyone," she said quietly. "We can't give Thomas his life back or return the years that were taken from Isaac. But we can refuse to carry forward the version of the story that their oppressors wanted us to believe. We can correct the record. We can show that the respectable narrative only exists because people with less power were silenced or paid off." She paused, letting the words settle. "And maybe most importantly," she added, "we can learn to recognize the pattern. Because whenever we see gaps, whenever someone insists that a story is simple and clean, we can ask, who is missing? Who was painted out?" That habit of questioning is part of justice, too. After the talk, a few visitors lingered to speak with her. An older man with a southern accent told her about a portrait in his own family, a great-grandfather seated proudly, unnamed black figures in the background. Now I'm wondering who didn't make it onto that canvas, he admitted. Maybe it's time I start digging. When the gallery finally emptied and the museum staff began their closing routines, Elena stood alone with the painting one last time. The room was quiet, the only sound the faint buzz of the overhead lights. On the wall label, the final line she had written caught her eye. This work is presented unchanged, but no longer unquestioned. That was the essence of it. She had not restored the erased figure to the canvas. The museum had decided that altering the original object would create a new distortion. Instead, they had restored him to the story, through X-rays, documents, and words. The lie remained visible, but it was now bracketed, annotated, contradicted. The painting could still speak, but it no longer had the privilege of speaking alone. As she gathered her things and turned to leave, Elna looked one last time at Thomas's uneasy face. In the glow of the gallery lights, surrounded by explanations that would have horrified his father, the boy seemed different. No longer just the tragic heir of a cruel household, but a fragile link between two worlds. On one side, inherited power. On the other, a man like Isaac, forced to choose between truth and survival. The deal that had once bought the Whitfields decades of silence had finally expired. Not in a courtroom, not in a newspaper, but here, in a museum, in front of visitors who could carry the story farther than any of its original participants ever imagined. Elena stepped through the doorway and into the dim corridor beyond, leaving the portrait behind. Yet she knew the real ending was not in that room at all. It was out there, in the way people would talk about the painting after they left, in the questions they would ask about their own family stories, in the suspicion they would bring the next time they saw an image that looked too perfect, too tidy, too certain. The Whitfields had tried to decide, once and for all, who would belong in their picture and who would not. More than a century later, that choice had been dragged into the open and reversed in the only way still possible, by refusing to accept the frame as the whole truth. In the end, the real power of the portrait was not in what it showed, but in what it forced everyone else to see.